Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in on this new episode of Speaking of the Art. My name is Mackenzie, and I am the operations manager at Epstein Performances, and I will be your host for today's podcast. I am so excited to bring you guys a really special guest, critically acclaimed composer, band leader, and most importantly, tenor saxophonist, James Brandon Lewis. We're going to invite him into the conversation of everything music. On today's episode, though, we are specifically going to touch on some topics about his musical history, his inspirations, molecular systematic music, and of course, his lovely new album, For Mahalia with Love. So, James, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. What an intro. Sometimes when I hear that stuff, I'm like, oh wow, okay, I'm actually making use of my time on this planet.
Absolutely, you are making waves. That is for
Right,
sure.
right, for sure.
So for my listeners, James is on the Epstein Performance roster. I know a little bit about him, but James, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself? Where did you grow up? When did you pick up the saxophone? You know, anything that
Oh
you
yeah.
think adds to your story.
Oh, for sure. Well, I've been residing in New York City for about 11 years. Prior to that, I was at the California Institute of the Arts, pursuing my master's degree, where I got to study with Charlie Hayden, Wadada Leo Smith, Joe LaBarber, Alfonso Johnson, so on and so forth. And then prior to that, I spent some time in Colorado, where my dad was living at the time, and was playing gospel music, and really, he's a minister, and then before that, I was in Washington D.C. So I've been traveling a bit, but I attended Howard University.
Okay, great.
Yeah, for my bachelor's, and I'm originally from Buffalo, New York.
Oh,
Started
James, I
playing.
didn't know that.
Oh yeah, I'm from.
I'm from Rochester.
Oh, that's where my sister is born.
Oh, okay.
And I lived there maybe I want to say maybe 2 years when I was a kid.
Okay.
But I was born in Buffalo. And so wow, Rochester, yeah. I spent a lot of time there for various reasons, various church functions and different things, back and forth between Buffalo and Rochester. But yeah, so I think basically the journey of music started when I was 9. My mom saw that I had an interest in music, and like most saxophonists, your first instrument is the clarinet. You know, it's the progression of the clarinet. And for whatever reason, I think it's more so to do with finger position. And then once you learn the clarinet, then you move on to, I moved on to the alto sax, and so on and so forth. Went to Buffalo Academy for the Visual and Performing Arts from 5th grade to 12th. And that's pretty much it. You know, my mom fostered an interest. I don't come from a musical family per se, but both my parents could definitely sing in tune. And so that helps. But yeah, that's, very proud of where I'm from, where I grew up, home of many amazing musical acts, current acts as well, Griselda, shout out to them. But then you have Grover Washington Jr., Annie DeFranco, the Goo Goo Dolls, um, uh, Joe Ford, Junie Booth, the great bassist Junie Booth, Charles Gale, avant-garde legend, tenor saxophonist, as well as piano, as well as alto sax. The list goes on and on. So the fabric is there, the fabric of me being exposed to many different genres at a young age. It's a groove town, I mean, you can find music is around, and when I was a kid, what's interesting enough is that I don't necessarily know if, as kids, me and my friends, we knew we were making music, we didn't think about having to move somewhere for the music to happen. It was already happening.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I remember playing concerts at local churches and different venues in Buffalo since forever when I was a kid. So it wasn't, but definitely moving away definitely challenged me in a different way and definitely exposed me to, even though I don't view music through a competitive lens, you know, when you're young, you need to be challenged, you know, to get you out of your comfort zone. And that is, for me, I felt it helped me. So.
Great.
So
So
yeah.
at what point did you identify yourself as an artist then?
Well, you know, what's interesting is that, well, that's an interesting question because to be honest with you, uh, I never really thought of myself as an artist per se.
Okay.
I mean, I knew I wanted to, you know, when I was younger, it was, oh, I want to make it with my friends.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I want to form a band with my friends. And really, what transpired was, you know, the reality that you finish undergrad, my phone wasn't ringing off the hook. Knew I had to go back to the drawing board. I had to study, you know, and really, I'm in a place now in my life where I can tell young people and older people, anybody that will listen, humbly, this is a life's work. There is no, you get to the height of technicality on your instrument and the doors just open up.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think the landscape changed. You know, I graduated 2006.
Okay.
The landscape of music has changed from the inception of jazz and the idea of opportunities and waiting for this phone call to happen from this elder or from this big band or for this thing. You know, so it really shifted how you consume, you know, what is how you consume music, number one, you know, um, with the internet, with YouTube. But then also, what did that mean for myself moving forward?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so composing tunes, continuing to reach out to elders. I always kept that in my in the forefront of my mind of keeping mentorship alive with whoever I was dealing with, but also um, when I started to perform in church solo after undergrad, and I was performing in local big bands in Colorado and going to jazz clubs and different things like that. But that really gave me, it was life circumstance that really kind of propelled me into, okay, what does it mean to compose your own music? Um, what does it mean to these were things that I wasn't really focused on in my undergrad. Undergrad, I was jazz performance. I was, you know, like studying the saxophone, you know, how to play standards, what chord scale relationships, all the normal things that everyone's been going through. And so eventually I got to a place where I'm playing hymns. I get curious about composing. Um, Actually, when I reflect, I was composing when I was a little kid, but I wasn't thinking that I was really doing it. I was just like, oh, like writing lyrics and then writing. My sister played instruments, you know, so I write a little bit for her, and you know, but I wasn't thinking about composing, you know.
Okay.
Then eventually, I started playing at church, playing by myself, playing hymns, and then thinking, oh, maybe I could do this. Maybe there's something. Maybe I have a voice in there somewhere. And then eventually, I got to a point where I applied to CalArts for my master's degree. And then that's when I felt like I could be an artist because the school, the way it was set up, encouraged composition. It encouraged anything that you wanted to play, you know, whether it was hymns, whether you want to arrange hymns, you want to play pop tunes, you want to play jazz, whatever you wanted to play, it fostered that. And then I'm in ensemble. I'm in ensemble with Joe LaBarber, you know, last drummer to play with Bill Evans. I'm with Alfonso Johnson and his ensemble playing original weather report scores and learning from him, with his experience being in weather report. And, so all of these, I'm playing in class with Charlie Hayden. We're playing together.
Yeah.
So all of these experiences really, really made me realize, oh, okay, well, I think I have a little to say.
Mm-hmm.
Not a whole lot. I don't need a whole lot. I'm from Buffalo. We don't need a whole lot to make it work. I mean, that's just, the city itself kind of builds a certain kind of grit inside you, a kind of work ethic, this kind of old industry town,
Mm-hmm.
the steel industry, the cities are, I have a lot of respect for the cities that surround those Great Lakes, because there's something about what once was, what America was about, steel industry, the automotive industry, So yeah.
Absolutely.
Hope that answers your question.
It did. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
So branching off of that then, because you said you studied with Charlie Hayden when you were at Cal Arts, and
Right.
he was one of your mentors. So what were some of the biggest influences from him? Like, what were your takeaways from studying with him?
Well, while I was at Cal Arts, Charlie started the jazz program at Cal Arts.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, I was aware of Ornette, interacting with Charlie Hayden, with Leo Smith, the whole AACM school in Chicago. I was getting the full continuum with all of these professors. But I'm playing with Joe LaBarbera. Yeah, we're talking about Bill Evans, but we're also going over, he's telling me about Buddy Collette and, another legend based on the West Coast. And so all of these experiences, Charlie would always come to class and talk about beauty and the essence of beauty and what that means. And, in visual art, they would call that like aesthetic, what's the aesthetic? And what they're really referring to is what's beautiful, what's the essence of what beauty is. And I think Charlie would always encourage that by way of the intention that he played in class, telling us about his family, telling us about a hike he went on, like a lived experience, a living, it's the whole idea of you can't play about love if you've never experienced it. This whole essence. And so I think about those things. And I loved Cal Arts in general because I got to be exposed to, just in their library alone, not only they have amazing faculty, but then, I'm learning about the whole history of Harry Parch and learning about Charles Ives and James Tenney and and John Cage, and then I'm it was just a full thing of people, of free thinkers, that I was exposed to. And so to have Charlie there and to talk about Ornette Coleman and what that meant to him, and what to hear these stories be less about myth and more about what actually happened. Him going to Ornette's house, and he's describing the scene. There's sheet music everywhere, and that really inspired. And he was so encouraging. Very much encouraged us to really play with intention and to play with a certain beauty. And I don't think beauty means perfection. I don't know if he meant that. What I meant was, in my opinion, beauty as in reference to being honest with whatever your truth is. To play with a certain sincerity and that is truth telling, as opposed to like, just learning just to learn, and you don't really mean it. You're playing, but you don't really mean it because you don't love it. And So anyways, yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Wow. I just am like sitting here picturing like everything you just described, walking
Mhm.
into like a house filled with sheet music and everything.
Right.
And for me, that is beauty to me.
Right.
Being
Of
surrounded
course.
by everything music, that is beautiful.
Right. Definitely.
So so are you a mentor now to some people, or like how do you see yourself now? Are
Well,
you
I definitely am at a place. It's interesting because I feel that I have encountered younger people reaching out to me.
Mhm,
And I still have a lot left to say, but 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 it's encouraging to be able to just disseminate some things that maybe I feel like I may or may have not received when I was their age.
mhm,
That might have helped me realize myself sooner.
mhm,
Um, and so the landscape. I mean, it's all up for grabs. And I think what I try to tell younger people is, hey, tell your story, but really tell it. Don't shortchange the story.
mhm,
Whatever your story is, you have to peel back the layers of your consciousness, or your onion, as I like to say, which
mhm,
has to do with which has to do with being analytical. Not, oh, I know it all. That's not what I'm saying at all.
mhm,
I'm saying that if you have an idea, how much of that idea do you want to investigate?
mhm,
I mean, that's ultimately why we dig Coltrane, because
mhm.
Coltrane has the balance of the objectivity and subjectivity. It's not one or the other. It's a balance.
Mhm.
This whole idea of it's what Ornette gave us. Ornette said, yes, there's melody, but become the melody, become it,
Uh, okay.
not analyze it, become it. You
Mhm.
know, and so you can learn from these, which then gets into the whole idea of metaphysics and intuition. One of my favorite philosophers is Heinrich Bergson, who talks about the idea of intuition as being a real, a better way of knowing. Because when you're intuitive, you're not outside of the object. Because to be outside of it, you're just analyzing it to where you understand the mathematics of it.
Mhm.
But if you're leaning on intuition, you're inside the object. You're
Mhm.
becoming it. It's also why acting is a beautiful thing too, because when someone's acting, they're embodying.
Right.
It's less about it's kind of like, oh, I wonder how they are. No, you have to get in there.
Mhm.
And musicians do that too. When they're transcribing, when used to transcribe as a kid, they say, oh yeah, imitate whatever, this whole, a lot of these different teaching methods that people. But what I like to think about is when you're transcribing, you get to you get a sense of that emotional fabric in which this person is playing, because it's not just the notes, it's
Mhm.
the articulation, it's the nuance, it's the dynamic level, it's everything. And that's just one way of learning. That's not the ultimate way of learning, but that's just one way to get inside that intuitive sense of yourself, and um get to that place. So yeah, anyways, that's where I'm at. That's where I'm at in life right now. Thinking about these things on a deeper level than just um, the mechanical side of things. I mean, I feel like that stuff is important, but it's at this point in my life, I have to ask myself, humble myself to say, all the training, and now grandma doesn't know what she's talking about? No, that's not it. Grandma actually knows more, but we get more, you know, with, oh, we're trained, we know more, and we have our, you know, our pronoun adjective agreements in place with sentence structure. And now grandma, she just knows what she's talking about, but she's not. No, that's not the right. The thing is that the more you know, the more you discover what you don't know. And so I think that that's where I'm at now with music. Is like, it's a lived experience. It's a philosophical approach, um, for me. That's, I trust me, I study a fair amount, but I never lose sight of that folk nature, that organic nature,
Yeah, that's
Um,
important.
it- yeah, it's important.
Right. So speaking of, like the free jazz movement and everything, who are you influenced by? And do you take any of those influences and use them in your style, or, kind of create something new with it? Like, tell me a little bit about
Well, well, I definitely, when we think about these categories, the categories are always interesting to me because, um, I like to push against those categories often. And most of the artists that I listen to, um, like for instance, we're talking about categories.
that.
So over COVID, I was listening to tenor saxophonist Teddy Edwards,
Okay.
who's from the West Coast. And he was, I guess, quote unquote, bebop. Now, what's fascinating about Teddy Edwards is that I found an interview of him that he did, in which instead of calling chords, he called them sound bodies. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. And he's like, and so his approach is that when you're actually playing, you just reach and grab a note out of these sound bodies that you actually like.
Hmm.
So for me, I'm influenced by the whole canon. But I definitely, like right now, if you say, well, who are you listening to now? Well, today I was listening to Andrew Hill's first album.
Okay.
Over over COVID, I was listening to, which his first album is called So in Love. And it's James, no, Malachi Favors on bass, and then James Singleton on drums. And then over COVID, I was also checking out Bill Barron, you know, Kenny Barron's brother, great tenor saxophone player.
Mhm.
One of my go-to albums is an album he made called Motivation. So, I love the Dewey Redmans. I love John Coltrane's. I love Sam Rivers. I like Frank Lowe. This beautiful record he made called Black Beings that includes William Parker, who I
Ooh.
played with for the last 11 years. So I don't know. That's a hard question for me to answer because I literally spend time thinking of course, that's New York City traffic, folks. Uh, uh, I try to spend a fair amount of time with each person that inspires me. It just depends on what the mood is. But what I like to think about is, you know, to discover people with their own systems of thinking. To play with William Parker, um, to be able to call Henry Threadgill, a mentor and someone I can call and really the same thing with without Leo Smith, alternative ways of thinking about music that ceases to be about uh, a separation, but more of a continuum of the possibilities of what can happen. Um, it's it's you know it's no different than when I think about quote unquote classical music, or like I love Charles Ives. I think, wow. But then I also over COVID, not even over COVID, I was listening to recently. I was listening to, gosh, I can't remember the saxophonist that I was listening to. But he was a classical saxophonist, and he had these really interesting books on rhythm and music and harmony. But anyways, but it was outside of. I just love to learn. I think the categories are cool, but then people subscribe certain ideologies to the categories that aren't necessarily true.
Yeah.
And so that ends up being a problem. And so for me, I just go with it. I'll leave the judging for other people.
Okay.
But for me, I mean, if you would have met me when I was 20, I was transcribing Dexter Gordon like every other 20-year-old. But now I'm 40. And so my progression should look a little different than continuing to transcribe the same people that I've been transcribing or listening or thinking about music in the same way since when I was in my 20s. Life is constantly moving. That's one thing I can say about Charlie Hayden and all of the people that I just mentioned. They're constantly progressing, constantly moving and constantly dismantling the notion of categories.
Yeah, well, I feel like your new album too kind of also touches on the dismantling of categories too, because you literally had to take these 9 gospel songs
Right.
and kind of like there was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I cannot help but see maybe there was like a little bit of challenge there trying to figure out how to kind of turn it into like your sound and jazz.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, if you want to go ahead and talk about that album
Oh,
as
of course.
well.
Of course. For Mahalia with Love was introduced to her music by my grandmother. So I look at it as very much an extension of conversations that I've had with my grandmother, and not the first conversation I've had with my grandmother over the years. I featured her on my recording Days of Freeman from 2015, and so I'm always throughout all of my albums having a conversation with my cultural influences, having a conversation with showing generations, this idea of talking to the people before me, both alive and not. And so I'm constantly in dialogue with my own identity when it comes to spirituality, when it comes to what it means to remember her voice, my grandmother, and the continuation of that voice, and really, I think, when I have these projects, I'm thinking conceptually about a thing like, okay, what is it that I would like to reveal about myself via my music? And so I feel like for Mahalia with Love, finally, I reached a beautiful synthesis of my jazz training with growing up in the church, with playing hymns. I could finally hear what the music should sound like. and finally felt secure in that. And so definitely a challenge to play any um, a song that's meant to be sung. But I mean, how is that any different than any of the jazz tunes that were sung, you know, instrumentally? I think it's the same concept. Is that I listened to a fair amount of Mahalia Jackson, and I could have dug deeper into songs that were maybe more obscure that she sang, but I wanted to specifically reference songs that specifically I know my grandmother liked. You know, this isn't about, oh, now I'm playing the most obscure Mahalia because, you know, I'm trying to prove a point. No, I'm also thinking about my grandmother, having a conversation with her. And so one more. Having a conversation with her. And so in listening to Mahalia and learning about her life, and it was to have, it's the same, she sang with the same intention that I experienced with Charlie Hayden or with any of the people that I just previously mentioned. She played with that same intention. And so I also wanted it to be a conversation, speaking of free jazz, but I wanted to be a conversation that while I love Albert Ayler and I love John Coltrane and I love Gene Ammons and people, Hank Jones, people who have covered the spirituals, one contemporary person, Angela Christie, you know, a woman saxophonist who was popular in the gospel world when I was growing up.
Okay.
And most people don't even know about. You see, this is, but I wanted to have these conversations of, my thought process was, well, why not Mahalia Jackson? Why not cover someone? Why not also be in, you know, put the narrative out there that, you know, for me, the whole notion of when I think about my mom, I think about my grandmothers. I think about me being around strong women. For me, it's just natural. You know, to that was the next for me, the progression. I've always had these, you know, albums pointing to different things, but felt it was time, and felt it was time just because I'm getting older and my grandmother is getting older, and I, you know, I treasure the time right now in this moment. You know, I don't take for granted these moments, and so definitely had to pay attention to her nuance. You know, to Mahalia Jackson's nuance, and it was definitely a challenge. It was definitely a challenge, but also if you know the lyrics, you memorize the lyrics. I sang a lot of these tunes. Not all the tunes I could find that Mahalia sang, but most of them. You know, like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was just, I love that tune. You know, so I gave myself some leniency with being very strict on what song she did. But I just like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And so yeah, no, thank you for the question. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no. For our listeners, by the way, please go listen to this new album from Mahalia with Love. You can get it on any streaming platform. I assume I'm an Apple Music fan, so that's where I listen to this album. But please go check it out. It's a beautiful album. The last subject that I wanted to touch on was molecular systematic music. Now, that is really fascinating to me. I know some of the other agents in our office also talk about that too, and we're really curious about what it is. Can you tell us exactly what it is and how does this show up in, in music in our life?
Okay, yeah. So basically, long story short, molecular systematic music really examines the role of creative encounter and how creative encounters and how that shows up as transformative experiences via artistic DNA.
Okay.
So when you think about the idea of John Coltrane and A Love Supreme, his encounter, his initial encounter with God and A Love Supreme being a manifestation of that. Or you think about Ralph Ellison and his book Invisible Man, and the idea of using uh, the metaphor of invisibility to make a comment socially on Blackness. So my creative encounter happened via listening to some of my improvisations years ago. And in my mind's eye, I I visualized a spiral. I saw two notes oscillating back and forth in my mind, and I began to map that and try to figure out, okay, what is that? And stumbled on the double helix and the way that um, kind of creatively put me in a headspace of thinking about notes differently, organizing structures differently, visual metaphor. I created my own molecule that is an idea generator.
Okay.
So very similar to, it's also a lived experience. So I have, people hear these terms and they get afraid. It's like when you say giant steps to jazz music, oh my God, everyone gets freaked out. No, it's just to unpack it in its simplest form is that molecular systematic music is very much metaphor, but also very literal in the sense of how I'm structuring. Metaphor is the idea of seeing something in the context of another. Leonard Bernstein said that. And so I think that viewing music and the way I'm structuring things um, in a figurative way of, this kind of like what are the basics of music, and then how do I use these intervallic structures to interact with the basics in my own unique way via, the idea of, it's like if you have a visual artist sit and do a still painting of something they're observing. Well, that's what I'm doing. I have this molecule, I'm observing it. Then off of whatever that molecule is giving me, I create these compositions. And so that's what that's about. And I'm also working on that. I'm getting a doctorate in creativity, where I'm describing this, as, molecular systematic music being, basically I'm examining the role of creative encounter as a series of transformative experiences to shape artistic DNA. So that has a lot to do with, and the list goes on and on. And when you think about Picasso and Guernica, the visual art piece he made after Spanish-American War, and so all of these beautiful experiences. I think that was Spanish-American War. Don't quote me on that, but anyways, so the idea of transformation, and it's like when you think about Ornette Coleman and him acquiring an alto sax and him thinking that it was in the key of C, that moment there transformed him to come up with his own clef, his own relationships with multiple clefs and multiple, and the harmonics, and or when you think about surrealism, all these great movements had a creative encounter that led to transformation. So basically my creative encounter is the idea of metaphor being transformative. And that metaphor for me is using science as metaphor for music.
Wow.
You could tell I've been thinking about this a lot.
No, it's great. I
Yeah,
mean, you said you're currently getting your doctorate
right.
in
A
creativity,
doc, yeah,
or
a doctor of philosophy and creativity at the University of the Arts. It's
okay.
a low res. It's a low res. So let's get the performances happening.
Yeah.
You know, just to let you all know, this, I'm not hanging up my performances for this. It's
Oh
all
no.
one. It's all one experience. But yeah, so I think so that's what it is in a nutshell.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are you like still kind of developing this, or how are you doing it?
Yeah, no, I mean it's constantly developing. I've won several different residencies. I just came back from a residency called Ragdale in Lake Forest, Illinois. Prior to that, I was
Mhm.
at the McDowell in New Hampshire for 5 weeks. So it's a work in progress. It's a life's work, and um, you know, uh, God willing, if everything works itself out, the combination. I have uh, 2 or 3 albums that I've made of music from these ideas, and more music to come, but also a book in 2025, and also more performances that use these, and also showing the graphics and the whole system of how I'm using this, because right now it's interesting. I'm the more I the more I discover about this the system, and really breaking free from what I would say is the residue of my training to get to reveal who I am to myself. It's like the idea of, I think about this story of Charlie Parker getting a cymbal thrown at him, and
Mhm.
how that creative act in itself maybe revealed itself to him. That experience, I'm not talking about violence. I'm not talking about it from that perspective. I'm
Mhm.
saying that act revealed something to him about himself. And maybe he's like the embodiment of this whole idea of uh, the birth of tragedy, Nietzsche, Apollonian and Dionysian thought, the chaotic versus the stable, and so it's really bringing about different things, and of how I want to continue to be, and revealing certain things about myself, because ultimately we use this language all the time. You can watch ESPN on any day of the week, and ESPN is like, well, the DNA of this team. Well, what are they talking about? They're talking about the
Mhm.
structures of what are the characteristics that make this team what it is,
Mhm.
and that's ultimately it's an examination of self. It's a self portrait. It's a living self portrait. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So because I'm also curious too,
Yeah.
where can we find out more about, molecular systematic music? I know you said you had two
I've written.
albums that were based off.
Yeah, I have 2 albums. Um, well, actually 3 albums. There's Molecular, there's Code of Being, and then Molecular Systematic Live, which is um, easily available on any of the streaming sites, as well as you can go to aerosmithpress.com, I believe, aerosmithpress.com. And I've written a couple of articles on these theories. Um, and they're very user friendly. It's not anything that folks can't grasp.
Right. Okay, cool.
Yeah, awesome.
All right. Well, thank you so much, James, for taking the time out of your day to
Yes.
talk with me. And is
Oh,
there
thank you.
anything that you want to leave with the listeners before we log off?
Yeah, keep supporting music. Don't let the robots take over.
I agree.
keep supporting live music.
Yes.
All
Keep
right.
going to shows, concerts, all of that.
Exactly.
If you are interested in James's music, obviously check him out on the streaming platforms. He is also on our website,
Of course.
epsteinfoxperformances.com.
Of
He's
course.
got some videos on there. You can also, there's a link to the Downbeat article that he was featured in. So please go
Right.
check it out. And yeah, thank you so much, James, for
Awesome.
enlightening
Thank you.
us today.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.